All right, so now we'll take a look at the carpal bones. Everyone develops their own little mnemonic, but the way that I've always remembered is S, L, T, P, T, T, C, H. Okay? Now, we look at the bones of the carpals itself. From a dorsal view, we're missing one, and that's the pisiform, the P here. So the pisiform is not seen on a dorsal view. It is seen on a palmar view. What we see here, starting with our, scaphoid, lunate, triquetrum. We have our hamate, capitate, trapezoid, trapezium. Okay, well, looking at it from a palmar view, we're going to start at the scaphoid again. Scaphoid, lunate, triquetrum, and then what sits on top of the triquetrum is going to be the pisiform bone. We have our trapezium, trapezoid, capitate, hamate, and just pointing out a specific feature of the hamate bone, which is the hook of the hamate. Now looking at the metacarpals, you can see these are our metacarpals here. We have 5. We can number them 1 through 5, starting at the first digit with a thumb. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And something to appreciate here is that each of our metacarpals has a head, a shaft, and a base. Okay? The head of our metacarpal is going to be at its most distal portion. So this would be considered the head of metacarpal number 3. This would be considered the base of metacarpal number 3, and then the shaft of metacarpal number 3. Okay. Now something I also want to point out here, this is our first metacarpal. We have our phalanges here, but you can also appreciate the type of joint that this is that articulates. We know that the articulation of the thumb, or excuse me, it's the base of the first metacarpal, and the trapezium is going to be a saddle joint. Now we have our phalanges. Now in almost all the digits, we have a proximal phalange, a middle phalange, and a distal phalange, or phalanx, okay? And each of those is going to have a head, a shaft, and a base, okay? The exception here is going to be the thumb. In that the thumb, we have a first metacarpal, we have a proximal phalanx, and we have a distal phalanx. We do not, in the thumb, have a middle phalanx. All right, so we'll look through the lower extremity, pelvic girdle. Now, starting with the ilium. So the ilium is this broad, fan-shaped superior portion of the hip bone, okay? This is what forms the largest part of our pelvis, and it provides attachment for a lot of the trunk and the lower limb muscles. This is different from our ischium, okay? And our ischium is going to be this posterior inferior portion of the pelvis, okay? This is going to bear most of the weight when you're sitting on it, when you're sitting down, okay? You're going to be putting a lot of your weight on your ischial tuberosities, really just your ischium in general. And then finally, we have our pubis, and this is going to be the anterior inferior portion of the hip bone, and this is going to contribute to the anterior pelvis, okay? We also call this the pubic arch, okay? And it's the pubis bone that makes up primarily the pubic arch, excuse me. We find that we have a cartilaginous ring between the pubic bones, forming the pubic symphysis. We have an acetabulum, which is this deep cup-shaped cavity formed by all 3 hip bones, and that articulates with the head of the femur. So if you can imagine the head of a femur coming out here. And then finally, we have an obturator foramen, and that is going to be these large openings, large oval openings formed by both the ischium and the pubis. Okay? The ischium primarily posteriorly, the pubis anteriorly. And this is what allows our obturator nerve to run through there, and some of our vasculature as well. A different view. And here, I like this picture on the right here, in that it really breaks up, it gives us a good indication of how the pelvic bone is actually broken up. And that superiorly, we have our ilium, we have our ischium in the back here, and then we have our pubis in the front. We're going to go over each of these in a little bit more detail, outlining some of the bony features that each one contains. Okay, starting with the ilium, there are a couple areas that I want to point out. The first one being the anterior superior iliac spine. Okay, anterior superior iliac spine. This is going to be a anterior projection superior to that of the inferior iliac spine, but it's going to be at the end of the iliac crest. Okay. All right, and this is easily palpable on us when we'll say in class, palpate your hip bone. That's typically what most people are going to pick, is that anterior projection. We call that the anterior superior iliac spine. You'll also hear this. Oops, I can do so much more with Apple Pencil. Thank you. What? All right, hopefully this doesn't ruin the video. But we call this, oh my God. We call that the ASIS. Okay. Now, if we have a superior, we have to have an inferior. Okay. And our inferior, I'm not loving the green anymore, is going to be our anterior inferior iliac spine. Anterior inferior iliac spine. Okay. This is going to be a small projection just above the acetabulum. Okay. Just above the acetabulum. And it, again, serves as a muscle attachment site. Our iliac crest is going to be the curved superior border of the ilium. And that is what helps us extend from our ASIS to our AIIS. So we have an anterior and an inferior and an anterior superior iliac spine. We also have a posterior superior iliac spine and a posterior inferior iliac spine. Okay, we label these as PSIS and PIIS. Okay, so the PSIS, and we'll see this in palpation lab, often see a skin dimple, back of the hips, and now those are our PSIS. Okay, and then finally we have our iliac fossa here. Okay, and that's just going to be the concave internal surface of the ilium. Next slide. Oh, God. Okay. So just a different view here. So we can move on to the ischium. We have a couple different projections here. I think this is a better visual for us. Couple things I want to point out, one of which is going to be the ischial spine. So the ischial spine is going to be this pointed projection on the posterior border of the ischium. Okay? And this is what separates our greater from our lesser sciatic notches, and again serves as a bony attachment for some of the ligaments. And then something that some of you might be familiar with, but this is going to be our ischial tuberosity. Okay, this is going to be our a little bit of a rougher prominence on the inferior ischium, and that's going to bear most of our body weight when sitting. And this is actually where we attach, or we have attachment of our hamstring muscles. Nope. Okay. So, and the last portion of the pelvis that we'll look at is going to be the pubis, okay? So the body of the pubis is going to be the medial portion of the pubic bone that articulates with the opposite pubic symphysis, okay? And this is kind of the area that we're looking here, okay? The body here. Our superior ramus is going to be the upper extension of the pubis here, and then we have an inferior pubic rami as well, okay? And it's the superior portion of the ramus that helps really give and offer the contour for the acetabulum itself. So without that superior pubic rami, we really wouldn't have a ceiling for our acetabulum. Our pubic crest. So our pubic crest is going to be on the anterior border of the pubic body. And this is going to extend laterally from the symphysis as well. This would be considered our pubic crest. And then our pubic tubercle is going to be this most lateral projection, lateral anterior projection here. I don't know if you can see it here, but pubic tubercle, if you follow that all the way down, you'll see that lateral projection, and again serves as a attachment for the ligaments. Different view. We can look at the femur itself. So we look at the femur. We start here with the articular surface, which is the head. Right below it is going to be our neck. This is the most commonly fractured area of the femur. Our shaft. We have a lesser trochanter and a greater trochanter. Greater is going to be the larger, more lateral projection, where our lesser is going to be our smaller, more medial projection. Okay, we have something called an intertrochanteric line, which is going to be our anterior surface here. And that intertrochanteric line is going to be running between the greater and the lesser trochanters specifically on the anterior side. And this is different from the intertrochanteric crest, which is going to be on the posterior aspect. So think intertrochanteric line, anterior aspect. Intertrochanteric crest is going to be on the posterior aspect. We have something called the linea aspera. So the linea aspera is going to be this vertical ridge on the posterior shaft to serve muscle and fascial attachments. We have our medial condyle, which is going to occupy our articular surface, and our lateral condyle. Just above that, epi meaning above, we have our lateral epicondyle and our medial epicondyle. And just above the medial epicondyle is going to be our adductor tubercle, serving as the insertion for the adductor magnus tendon. Okay. And then finally, I almost skipped, but we have this intertrochanteric fossa here, okay, which is this deep depression on the medial aspect of the greater trochanter. And once again serves as a muscle attachment. We can look at the patella. We have the base of the patella here. This is going to be our anterior surface, so facing away from us. And then this is going to be articular surface, and this is what articulates with our lower leg to allow for movement at the knee joint. So I want you to know base, apex, which is going to be a little bit more of a point to it, anterior surface, which does not have articular cartilage, and the articular surface, which does have articular cartilage. Okay, we can take a closer look at the tibia. We have medial and lateral tibial condyles. These are going to be the enlarged lateral and medial ends of the proximal tibia. And this is what articulates with your femoral condyles. Okay? We also have lateral and medial tibial plateaus. This is going to be the smooth surfaces superior on the proximal tibia. Okay? And this is what supports the femoral condyles and the menisci as well. Okay? So we have our medial condyles, and we have our tibial plateau. Between that, we have something called the intercondylar eminence. Okay, this is this little raised ridge here. Okay, between the tibial condyles, and this is where we get attachment for our cruciate ligaments, okay, and menisci. On the anterior surface, we see our tibial tuberosity. That's the site for patellar ligament attachment. You might hear it called a patellar tendon attachment, but patellar ligament. Soleal line is going to run from laterally, proximally, to medially. Okay? From lateral to medial. All right? And if you couldn't tell by the name, but this serves as the attachment for the soleus muscle. And then finally, on the tibia, I want you to appreciate the medial malleolus here. And this is going to be the distal medial projection that forms the inner ankle prominence and articulates with the talus, which we'll talk about in just a second. Talus being your major ankle joint. So the fibula, 4 main characteristics here. So we have the head of the fibula at its most proximal end. Okay, and this is what articulates with the lateral condyle of the tibia. We have the neck is just inferior to that of the head of the fibula. The apex of the fibula is going to be our point of projection at the most superior part of the fibular head. So this is our fibular head, and this is the head of the fibula, and that would be the apex of the fibula, of the fibular head specifically. And then finally, we have our lateral malleolus down here and here. And that's going to be the distal projection forming the lateral prominence at the ankle, also articulating with the talus. All right, so we can take a closer look at the tarsals. We can start with, Okay, we could start with the calcaneus. Calcaneus is going to be the largest tarsal bone forming the heel. And at the top here, we can see we have a calcaneal tuberosity. And once we get into lab, we'll be able to palpate that. And then we also have on the next slide, it's tough to see because we don't have a great medial view here, but we have something called the susentaculum tali, which is on the medial aspect of the calcaneus, and that helps support the ankle, specifically the talus. So on the lateral aspects here, I'm outlining the contour of the cuboid bone. All right, and this is going to be our most lateral tarsal bone. Okay, this is what articulates with the calcaneus, the lateral cuneiform, and the 4th and the 5th metatarsals. So the cuboid articulates with the calcaneus, with the lateral cuneiform, and the 4th and the 5th metatarsals. This is different from our navicular bone, which is going to be our most medial tarsal bone. And this articulates with the talus and the cuneiforms. specifically the medial cuneiform, the intermediate cuneiform in the middle, and the lateral cuneiform. So I'll say it again. The navicular is going to be our most medial tarsal bone, and it articulates with the posterior calcaneus, and it articulates anteriorly with the medial cuneiform, the intermediate cuneiform, and the lateral cuneiform. Okay. Now, looking at the cuneiforms in a little bit more detail, we see that our medial cuneiform articulates with our first metatarsal. Our intermediate cuneiform articulates with the second metatarsal, and our lateral cuneiform articulates with our third metatarsal. We see, just to review, that our cuboid articulates with the fourth and the fifth metatarsal. Okay. All right, great. So the only thing I wanted to point out in this slide is this area here. This is called your susentaculum tali, and it's this medial projection on the calcaneus here, and we should be able to palpate that once we get into palpation lab. So we can look at the metatarsals. So we have 5 metatarsals in accordance with our 5 toes. And we can label them 1 to 5. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And very similar to our carpals, our metacarpals, we have a base, which is going to be at our more proximal end, our head, which is going to be at our distal end, and then our shaft, which is going to be the distance between the two. So the only other thing I wanted to point out here was going to be the tuberosity of the 5th metatarsal. And as we get into palpation lab, we should be able to palpate that. You should be able to palpate it on yourself if everyone finds their pinky toe and they keep moving their way down the foot. They start approaching the ankle bones, and you should feel on the outside of your foot, on the lateral aspect of your foot, you should be able to feel a little bony bump. We call that the tuberosity of the 5th metatarsal. All right, and then we have our phalanges. Similar to the metacarpal, we don't have an intermediate or middle phalanx with the first toe, or the first metacarpal. We do have it with all of the others. So we have a proximal, a middle, and a distal phalanx for each toe 2, 3, 4, and 5, with the 5th one having a really, really tiny distal phalanx. But we do not have a intermediate or middle phalanx on the hallux, which is what we call the big toe. Okay, we see that we have a first metatarsal, we have a proximal phalanx, we have a distal phalanx, and that's it. All right, I think that concludes our presentation here. Hopefully it was helpful. And then please reach out if you do have any questions.